Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being here and wanting to learn something new. Today, we're going to be talking about Disability Pride Month and why it matters to youth. And I want to preface just with this saying that a lot of people may not understand the intersectionalism of what disability and addiction and services to youth have in common in the traditional sense. So we're going to be diving into some things that may be uncomfortable for some people, but I'll preface that before we start on each slide. So first thing is, who am I? Hello everyone, I am Ruth Delpino. I am a prevention educator. I am the DFC coordinator at the Mercer Council for Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified in teaching English as a foreign language, leadership training, and life skills training, sorry. So I always preface my presentations with why this presentation? And a lot of people may look at this and say, okay, why do we need to know about this particular topic? Well, it's always for information. It's to inform you. It's not to scare you. This is not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. The other thing is that when we are talking about parenting, we're talking about youth involved adults. And this means that you can be a teacher, you can be a grandparent, you can be an aunt, uncle, a cousin. If you have a child in your life, this presentation is for you. Also, my perspective is shaped by my learning experiences, and my approach is shaped by my background. So when I look at this, I try to look at it as globally as possible and apply it to as many things as we can in this presentation. Also understand that this is evidence informed and some evidence based, meaning evidence informed. I take all this compilation of data, I use reputable resources, I compile them in a way and present them in a way so that you can follow along and look through what actually makes sense for you. Um, and also evidence-based in that I pull from many different programs that we have here at the council, one of them being life skills training, Too Good for Drugs, protecting you, protecting me, all of those sorts of things. When we're a nurtured heart approach, when we're looking at these things, I want people to understand that this is coming from a place of an informed decision on the parts of people looking at this information. And also, I do not speak for the disabled community. I do not speak with about people with disabilities. This is not something I'm an expert in, but this is something that I thought really needed to be talked about. One, because it's July and it's Disability Month, but more specifically because it is a month that needs to shine light on things that we don't necessarily have at the forefront of our minds. So strap in, and I hope you like this presentation because this was actually really fun and I learned a lot through this process. So first thing, what is disability? When I first started looking at this, I really didn't understand what disability was. Not in the, obviously we know what the general concepts are. I knew that there were mental, physical, and learning disabilities. I knew a lot about that, but I didn't understand that there are many different types of disability. And specifically, there are 8 subcategories that exist in the United States: mobile physical, spinal cord injuries, head injuries, vision, hearing, cognitive such learning disability, psychological disability, and invisible disabilities. This can range from medical disorders that you hide, or this can also be something that you are experiencing that no one else can see. So a lot of the time, people may have different forms and have to use wheelchairs in some capacity sometimes, but not always. And other times they can walk normally. And so there can be some invisible disability happening there. So it's more of an assumption on what people can and have the ability to do. So I have a video here. It just plainly explains what a disability is. And I figured it would be best for it to happen this way because it is based out of a YouTube channel that basically talks about disability and does it well. So
A disability is an impairment that may be cognitive, developmental, intellectual, mental, physical, sensory, or some combination of these. It substantially affects a person's life activities and may be present from birth or occur during a person's lifetime. Disabilities is an umbrella term, covering impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. An impairment is a problem in body function or structure. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or action, while a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. Disability is thus not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon, reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. Disability is a contested concept, with different meanings in different communities. It may be used to refer to physical or mental attributes that some institutions, particularly medicine, view as needing to be fixed. It may refer to limitations imposed on people by the constraints of an ableist society. Or the term may serve to refer to the identity of disabled people. Physiological functional capacity is a related term that describes an individual's performance level. It gauges one's ability to perform the physical tasks of daily life and the ease with which these tasks are performed. PFC declines with advancing age to result in frailty, cognitive disorders or physical disorders, all of which may lead to labeling individuals as disabled. The discussion over disability's definition arose out of disability activism in the United States and the United Kingdom in the 1970s, which challenged how the medical concept of disability dominated perception and discourse about disabilities. Debates about proper terminology and their implied politics continue in disability communities and the academic field of disability studies. In some countries, the law requires that disabilities are documented by a health care provider in order to assess qualifications for disability benefits.
Okay, so when I look at something like this, and I think a lot of people may look at this that way too, we're sort of asking excuse me, we're sort of asking, what does disability look like to certain people, right? And excuse me while I try to get out of this, because for some reason it's not letting me. Okay, maybe if there we go. I always get caught in the YouTube. So when we're looking at disability and we're trying to define it, there are a lot of different ways that people can look at it. And I want to preface with saying that more people have the ability to define what is a disability themselves, and medical professionals definitely can add validity to that. But as a person with a disability, there is a definite cognitiveness to it. There's a duality of knowing what's wrong with you and trying to get verification for it. So understand that some people may have a disability and it may be undiagnosed, or it may be not necessarily visible to other people and they may not know themselves. So when we keep that in mind, it can have an innate ability to sort of weave itself through the social stigma of what that means. So they play with social stigma a lot, especially if they've been undiagnosed or they're not able to get medically verified. So here we go. So when was it established? I think that this is really important because a lot of people may think, oh, Disability Pride Month has not necessarily been around a long time. And actually, the first Disability Pride was celebrated October 6, 1990, after the signing of the American Disabilities Act in 1990 in August, I believe it was. Give me a second. I'm going to click on this just to make sure. Yes, so it was, oh, sorry, July. It was in July. And I think what's really important about this is that the Americans with Disabilities Act covered a lot of ground when it came to people having autonomy over their own situation, over their own ability to interact with the world. And with this, it also added protections for a lot of people with disabilities to move forward and to hopefully be more, have their existence be more equitable. I do want to have these creators speak because I don't know what it's like to celebrate Disability Pride Month, but they do. So.
Taking pride in my personal disability is very much about like radically loving myself in a world that wants me to not love myself.
Whether it's physical disabilities, mental disabilities, neurodiversity, they're taking pride in who they are and finding people who say that what you need and who you are is not too much. Your disability isn't a weakness. It's a strength. It's a new way of seeing, and it's something that's worth being celebrated, and there are people who will celebrate that with you. I first learned about Disability Pride Month in a class that I took on disability studies. It was an attempt for me to connect with other disabled students and the disabled community in a way that I hadn't been able to before in college. There is a whole beautiful history of disabled folks, of disabled advocates fighting for our rights that we get to be a part of. There is an incredible disability culture of innovation and creativity and care and mutual aid that we get to learn from and live in.
Disability Pride Month is how I really started connecting with other disabled people and was like, oh my God, other people are feeling these feelings that I'm feeling and feeling the shame that I'm feeling. And then they're able to take that and turn it into pride rather than feeling like we have to shrink ourselves to fit into a non-disabled world.
I think we kind of give each other the courage to celebrate and to take pride when folks see other disabled people talking about their disabilities, talking about disability pride, and thinking, hey, if that person can be open and vulnerable about that, maybe I can do the same.
The world has, for so long, taught us that we should be ashamed of being disabled. The thing that really, really helped me be comfortable using mobility aids when I really needed them, but didn't know if I wanted to go out in public and use them, was seeing other disabled people being proud of using their mobility aids in public, being proud of being visibly disabled and owning it and being like, what other people think of me is not my problem. It's not my business what they think about me. I am doing what is best for me and my body. And if other people want to judge me or shame me for that, that's a them problem, not a me problem.
I think awareness is kind of the start, but disability pride takes it a step further and says that, it's more than just saying we are here. It's saying we are here and we belong. Conversations around awareness often kind of have a lean of cure to them, of, let's be aware of this so that we can cure it, fix it. And with disability pride, we are acknowledging that we don't need to be cured. We don't need to be fixed. We are not what needs to be fixed. It's this inaccessible world that needs to be fixed. Focus on fixing these systems that keep us out of public life, that keep us out of school, that make it harder for us to work, that keep us from getting married without losing our benefits in healthcare. Those are the things that need to be fixed, not our bodies.
Okay, so I highly suggest watching the rest of this because there's some really good information there. They also have some really good resources at the end. I also think what's really important about this is that, as you can see, a lot of this information was coming off of social media, and a lot of people may associate social media with hatred or anonymous posting online where people are able to vent their frustrations in a way that can be harmful or hurtful to others. But I think more specifically, when we look at this, it's to let people know that there is a connection with disability and people understanding that they are able to live their lives fully and freely. As you can see, a lot of these advocates were present on TikTok. They also have YouTube channels. I can link their YouTube channels below when we are done with this presentation. And what I find so interesting is that so many youth have access to these people. So many people have access to this information, to these representations of people enjoying life in a wheelchair or people having a disability and just navigating their world and fighting social stigma and understanding that they're allowed to exist as their body as they are, regardless of what other people should say they should look like, act like, or be like. And I think that's so important. And we're going to be talking more about the presence of social media and the presence of disability rights on social media. But I just wanted to reiterate that because I feel it's so necessary for us to see that it makes so much sense to see people like us living lives fully and living life affirming action, or having life affirming actions. And there's just, it's a gift that I don't think many people before social media were able to have. The next part here is to understand context. I will be actually putting some stuff in the description below once we're done, just because this next part does talk a lot about the Holocaust, or not gentrification, the Holocaust, some disability, hate crimes, and some hatred towards disabled people. So I just want to keep it out there that if you are not comfortable with this section, you can skip ahead to the time that I put below. So understanding context. Now, I think that there are quite a bit of context here, and I know I have a lot of links, but these all have a place in that when I'm talking about disabilities and we're trying to understand the context. The United Nations does quite a few different studies on especially developed nations and developing nations, but what they had said that there is quite a bit of lack of empirical evidence here. But they specifically wanted to look at the youth population, and this is just talking about youth. So this is 18 and below, and this is anyone who is below 18, but anyone who has a disability of any sort. So there is definitely a lack of empirical research for when it comes to looking at these numbers, because the prevalence of disabilities among youth is stigmatized so much that there could be a lot of hiding. There are in many cultures where people have their disabled family sitting inside all the time because they're not able to mobilize their bodies. But to sort of understand the context, the estimated number of children with disabilities between ages 0 to 18 ranges between 93 million and 150 million. So obviously that's a huge gap there. But if we were to take it even at its lowest number, that is still a lot of people that have any sort of disability, right? And these figures are a rough estimate, and they obviously reflect a lot of the insufficient data that the United Nations cannot have access to. Also, to understand that there are quite a bit of stuff going on, and I don't know how else to say this other than we're going to be talking about structural violence later. So I do want to preface with this first, and then we're going to be talking about how it actually affects people with disabilities later. But the Japanese actually have a long and shameful history when it comes to interacting with disabled people. There are many murder victims. There have been several people, and this was in 2016, so just be aware of that. There were stabbing deaths of 19 disabled people in their sleep last July in Japan, because there's a lot of stigma about people who have disabilities in Japan specifically. It was basically this person in particular who was actually someone who wanted to commit mass crime on people with disabilities. And essentially what he had said was anybody with a disability is someone who cheats off the system, is someone who doesn't deserve to have food, water, shelter, all those sorts of things. And obviously that's a really extreme example, but that just comes to show that there is a visceral hatred for people that look different, that function differently, that have different abilities. And he basically said, what's the point in having these people around if they could, give away their resources to somebody else, which obviously is a very extreme stance to take. But I want to reiterate that it's not something that is that uncommon, because there have been many reiterations of looking at disabilities as people who are subpar or subhuman. And we're also going to be sharing some of that as well. I am hesitant to talk fully about what happened here just because there is a lot of violence here. But if you are able to look at the presentation, or sorry, the article below, then please do so. I will link this in the description also. So looking here, we also have here, and this is something that I really want to reiterate as well, that there is a lot of people in the United States who have disabilities. But of the 62 million children in the United States who are under age 15, almost 10% of them have a disability. Now, if we're talking about 62 million people, about 10%, that is 6.2 million children that have a disability in the United States. Now, New Jersey specifically, that breakdown is obviously much different. But when we're looking at this here, it means that there's a much bigger prevalence to people with disabilities than we realize. And to have things like the media and culture and things like that to shine light on those sorts of things is really important. But I also want to say here that there are people, and this is something that is going to be called structural violence, where there are people in particular, and this is a professor at Princeton University who believes certain babies with disabilities should be no longer exist. So, and he, and when I look at this, I want to reiterate that this is not something that is the reflection of any belief in particular. I am just speaking on the reality that there is a lot for us to work through as a society, because there are a lot of people when we're looking through abortion, like rights of people with disabilities, all those sorts of things, there's an intersection that a lot of people don't realize. And with that intersection comes with a lot of people who are inherently giving structural violence capacity. And when we're looking at that, there's a lot of things wrong with this. And I don't necessarily want to talk about this in particular too much, but what he had essentially is saying is that anyone with a disability, when they're born, do we really need to have them as part of our society? And obviously, that is a huge statement to make, and not necessarily something that we support here at the council, but it is something that has happened. Also, another thing I want to reiterate too is that people with disabilities, especially during Nazi Germany, were executed and were part of the Holocaust specifically. People with disabilities, it was something called the mercy death, or an Operation T4. A lot of the time, people with disabilities could either be operated on, were scientific studies of any sort. And that was something that was heavily regulated in Nazi Germany. And I think what needs to be said more than anything else is that these people in particular, this society and this country at this time, made a decision on what the value of a person's life is based on a disability that they had, or based on the the race that they were and things like that. But specifically, we're talking about disability, right? And when we're talking about this, I don't think that there is another way to put it other than it is just plain and blatantly ableist to say that certain people don't deserve access to life, to resources, to a fulfilling existence because they have a disability. And that is exactly what Nazi Germany had decided. So when we talk about people that make fun of people with disabilities, when we talk about people that are looking or are making jokes about people with disabilities, or have a weird uncomfortability around them, that does not mean that they are affiliated with Nazi Germany. That does not mean that they are this person, a professor from Princeton University. What it does mean is that there are steps to enable a society that lead to many harmful effects and can lead to extreme structural violence. Excuse me. So understanding that, I think that is a truly important aspect for us to reflect upon. So I also want to talk about learning disabilities because a lot of the time we know that structural violence especially exists with people who have physical disabilities. We know that ableism exists with people with physical disabilities. Ableism also can be something. And if you're looking at these definitions or you're like, I don't understand what ableism is, I have a particular video that I made talking about ableism. And I had also done a article last year on ableism in July as Disability Pride Month. So I will be linking those below if that is something that you can understand or you're not up at this level of really trying to grasp onto these things without knowing the basics first. So I will also link those presentations below. I do want to say that there was this one particular study that I read that quite frankly boggled my mind because I thought it was really interesting for a lot of different reasons. But what they had found was they were looking at the learning disabilities and the reading comprehension of Texas inmates. They had looked at 130,000 Texas inmates in prison populations. They randomly selected 253 of them, and 80% of those randomly selected Texas inmates had a learning disability. Now, when we look at this, I think that it is something that kind of reiterates the ability for people to navigate a system that wasn't built for them. And learning disabilities are just one of those things that schools in particular may have a hard time interacting with. People in particular may not understand. Learning disabilities can range, obviously, right? So you have ADHD, you have anxiety, you have social anxiety, you have autism spectrum disorder, you may have things like Down syndrome. Those are the sorts of things where when we look at this, that is the learning disability, right? And so that in particular, all encompassing, if 80% of those randomly selected inmates had a learning disability and they're in prison, maybe there was something that could have been done beforehand to mitigate any sort of crime that they may have committed that landed them there in the first place. And I think that this is such an important number to look at because without the protective factors of being included in school, without the protective factors of being instructed in a particular way that they can learn, if there are no protective factors for these people to feel like they're actually someone who is able to do something in a school system or believe that they're smart enough to go on and do something that's worth their while, then this can be the reality for them. They can end up in jail, and they can end up in jail having a learning disability because there were so many roadblocks to their protective factors. Now, also understand that they had quite a few different things here. I also just want to reiterate a couple of things. Also, learning disabilities include things like dyslexia, dyscalculia as well. We hypothesized, and this is from the study, I'm just studying it right now. We hypothesized that poor single word decoding, the chief feature of dyslexia, accounts for a significant percent of that particular 253 randomly selected population. Among them, we conducted a cross-sectional sample survey of recently admitted Texas inmates, beginning with social and educational background and followed by an educational test battery. The deficient performance was defined primarily as single word coding performance that measured below the 25th percentile of the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test. We found that 47.8% of those inmates were deficient in word attack skills. Now, what does that mean? That means a little less than half of these people had a learning disability where they were not able to comprehend what they were reading. They were not able to look specifically at words and paragraphs and really understand what they were reading and what they were absorbing. Now, does that mean that they, have lower IQs or anything like that? No, it means that they were not able to learn in a system that was structurally not meant for their ability or disability of learning. Now, another thing that I do want to talk about here is that specifically with disability, obviously learning disability in particular is something that is much more invisible. So you're not able to see it as much, and learning disabilities most of the time are invisible. So when you're looking at anything like this, when we're looking at disability, when we're looking at those sorts of things, when we want to understand structural violence, this is sort of what we're talking about here. And so I also want to reiterate that structural violence is what I had been alluding to for a little bit of a while now. It is indirect violence and sometimes institutionalized violence. Okay, so it is differentiated from personal violence and refers to preventable harm or damage to persons where there is no actor committing the violence or where it is not practical search for the actors. So such violence can occur from unequal distribution of power and resources, or in other words, it is said to be built into the structures, meaning that it is a systemic issue, that regardless of whether or not you had people who were ableist and you took them outside of that system, the system would still be ableist due to the decisions and the way that the structure is made. Now, structural violence is obviously different than actual like physical violence or verbal violence on to people in part of the disability community. But to understand that structural violence in itself gives permission to people with ableist ideologies. Now, what I mean by that is if ableism is part of the structure, it reinforces the idea that it's okay for certain things to happen. And what we find is that it can be difficult for certain people to understand how to deal with these disabilities. And it's not necessarily innately evil, it's just something that happens, right? So in particular, when we're talking about presence of violence still being violence, we may have things such as, people reading headlines about people who are disabled being slaughtered, or people who are disabled not being able to marry their significant other because they may lose their health benefits. Those are the things that are structural violence, in that it takes away the protective factors of a person to exist fully in that society. Now, sort of shifting with that, the structural violence also inherently defunds or detaches the ability of understanding for certain populations and takes away that for practicing practical areas of life. So for example, law enforcement, and this is something that we actually see a great correlation with. And there was this one study that was done by NAMI, Illinois.org, and what they had found was half the people killed in by police had a disability. Now, that means that almost half of the people who die at the hands of police have some kind of disability, according to a new report. And officers are often drawn into emergencies where urgent care may be more appropriate than lethal force. So a lot of people who in particular may have autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, those sorts of things, may not respond well to practices that a police force may have when they go in understanding that a crime has occurred. A lot of the time, police officers need to have much more practice with interacting with people with learning disabilities and disabilities in general because of the staggering numbers. Now, does that mean that all police officers are inherently ableist? That is not the statement. The statement is that a lot more people need to know how to interact with people with disabilities in order to give them the services they need to get to where they need to go. Now, that obviously was a lot. That's a lot of numbers, a lot of things to look through, but I wanted to reiterate that because there's so much to this, and there's so much more to this that we don't understand. Now, also, I want to reiterate some ableism here. Looking at the person, I know that a lot of people may look at this, and I know a lot of people, especially with autism spectrum disorder, say that looking people in the eye can actually be very difficult. So look at the person when you're speaking to them. This is great advice for people who are in corporate America who want to shake hands with each other, right? But does that mean that it is something that everyone can do? No. And it's important to acknowledge this because this is an example of everyday blatant ableism, and it can be a microaggression to people who have disabilities. So another one could be, why are they always looking at their phone? A lot of people may say, oh, Generation Z is always on technology, things like that. Most of the time, people use their phone as a coping skill because they can't look at people or they can't interact socially the same way. And I think what I would encourage people to do is to proceed with without judgment, but also to understand that sometimes people are on their phones for an array of reasons. And to also note that when you're looking at a person in the eye when you're talking to them, that is not inherently something that many people can do because it's biologically against what that person is capable of. Also understanding that people that may be deaf, make sure that if they can read lips, you are not covering your face or your lips just so that they can understand you and that you are providing the best resources to them, even if you don't know sign language, those sorts of things. Also, employment is affected by the systems we have in place. And there are a couple of studies for substance use disorders and age of hearing loss studies, which I will allude to in the next slide. Also understand that for people without disabilities, technology makes things easier. So a lot of the time people may see a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder listening to music. They may see people with different disabilities using wheelchairs or, using any sort of mobility aid. And a lot of the time, a lot of people don't understand, for people with disabilities, technology makes things possible. And possible is something that not a lot of people with disabilities always have on their side. So, excuse me for a second. So I did some research on addiction and disability, and this is by theaddictioncenter.com. It talks about the correlation between the two. Obviously, learning disabilities and physical disabilities have a different context here, but depending on the disability, roughly 9% of people have both an SUD and a coexisting disability. So if you have a disability, roughly 9% of that population have a substance use disorder, and 7 to 26% of individuals with intellectual disabilities in particular have addiction-related issues depending on the exact condition. Now, what does this mean and why would I put it in here? So when we're looking at intellectual disabilities in particular, like I had said before, dyslexia was definitely a huge prevalent theme going on with that inmate study. What we're looking at here is intellectual disability sort of reiterates the idea that you are less than, or that you're not able to be as smart as. There's this one Albert Einstein quote that says, if you tell a fish to climb a tree for its whole life, it's going to think it's his whole life that it's stupid, something along those lines. And it's the same thing where when you shape a world where people don't believe that they belong, it reiterates the protective factors that can't exist for them. And that means they don't reach out to school counselors. That means that they are not able to reach out to teachers when they don't understand something. That means they're not able to have the vocabulary to voice their concerns and their opinions and their condition. Now, another thing too is that a lot of people with physical disabilities in particular may take pain medication, and this can lead to a lot of different areas here. So you can have financial problems because insurance doesn't always cover everything here in the United States. Opioids are a huge factor as well because people use them to take away their pain, and having a disability can be painful. Also, you are at risk of overdose if you use opioids, and a lot of people may be so frustrated by their pain that they may actually overdose on opioids inadvertently without intention. And the other thing too is that in reality, pain medication, if they become addicted to it or if they have access to it, they can use it as a coping skill. And that in particular is not necessarily a good thing for a lot of different reasons. But to understand that there are many different areas of disability where people think that they don't belong, and that stigma inherently and the systems they inherently have to interact with takes away their autonomy, and it takes away their courage to be themselves and who they are. And that in turn can lead to addiction. So really what it does is it takes away anything that they can navigate the world with on their side. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, I do have three in particular TikTok videos here. One not to say to someone with a disability, I thought this was interesting, so I figured
So
you know,
last year, I got in an accident that left me with a permanent disability. Here are some things I've learned that you should never say to someone who's disabled. Educating yourself is helpful, but pushing a quick fix that you read about on the internet is not. If they're the one with a disability, chances are they've Googled it and talked to doctors about it a whole lot more than you have. I hear this one all the time, and while the intentions are good, it minimizes my actual experience and draws attention to the fact that you didn't expect me to. Okay, so this one does vary based on person and situation, but most people with a disability just want to feel normal, and part of that is being able to talk about what's going on with them without making people feel uncomfortable. So last year, I got in an accident that left me with a permanent disability.
Okay, so there is that. Another one, oh, excuse me. Another one is this one, discrimination and accessibility. So explaining.
Imagine if one day everyone got the ability to fly except for you. Would you consider yourself disabled? Probably not, because you could still function completely normally. But then what if suddenly everyone builded things in the sky that you could only access if you can fly? You can no longer access things like everyone else. So you would probably consider yourself disabled. But were you disabled because of your body? No. It was society's lack of access that disabled you. This is the social structure of disability. This theory operates under the principle that it's not our bodies that disable us, but instead society, and if society was completely accessible, then no one would be disabled. I half agree with this. I fully believe that disability rights and disability justice is about fixing society, not disabled people, because we aren't broken. And if the world was more accessible, then disabled people wouldn't fix as much obstacles. But in other ways I disagree. Like, even if the world was completely accessible, I would still have medical issues. Other people still would. But I do think the social structure of disability teaches us a really important principle that I base my activism on, that we need to fix society. That's what we need for equal rights. Imagine if one day everyone got the ability.
So I thought that was really interesting. And most of these are made by Gen Z populations. So I thought that was also interesting. And this is also made by a Gen Z person. Excuse me for a second. What I want to reiterate is that these are people that are in high school. These are people that are experiencing life right now. And they're talking about their experiences with disability as it exists right now in the United States.
Experienced as a person with a disability. To preface, I've been wearing masks for a long time. My immune system works differently than most people's. Here is a picture of me wearing a mask for the first time 6 years ago. There are 2 things wrong with the way I'm wearing this mask, and only one of them was intentional. So my doctor tells me, you're gonna have to start wearing this mask to class. I'm sure many of us know just how pleasant it is to look a little different in high school. So this is all happening to me around the time that I am scheduled to go on a band trip to Disney World, something I've been looking forward to forever. My doctor says, you're not going on that trip unless you wear that mask at all times. So I start wearing my mask to class. I get a lot of attention from students and also from band parents. They fear that I will give my genetically inherited autoimmune disease to their children and that I should not be allowed on the band trip. Of course, I feel alienated, humiliated, and I don't want to show my face at school. It gets better. Take a look at part 2.
So all of these people, I will give their TikToks to you in the description below once this is on YouTube. But I really wanted to reiterate that these people in particular are speaking from personal experience, and that is not something I can do. So I want to make sure that people understand that when you want to understand disability, you want to understand a population in general, go to that population and ask them questions that are inherently respectful, where you want to come from a place of understanding and connection and not to exploit their struggles. So this is basically the end of the presentation. I want to reiterate that a lot of the time I have how can we help at the end of our presentation, but I don't think there is a lot for us to be like, oh, how can we help? It's that it is common sense a lot of the time to say, oh, if I want to learn more about this person, I'm going to do research on these people. So I'd say, how can you help? Doing more research, having inclusive teaching, understanding that people have different abilities in their work, in the workplace, in the school that they're in the environment that they're a part of, and to also make sure that if you have games for youth, if you have teaching for youth, if you have any system where youth have to interact and they are a captive audience, make sure as many people are accounted for as possible, and all the abilities are accounted for as well. There are many different areas where, and I had a particular story. I kept looking for this TikTok, but I just could not find it. But it ended up on my For You page, and it was about someone in particular who went to a public pool, and they had a hearing disability. They were legally qualified as deaf, and what they did was they were playing a game of Marco Polo, or hearing people had come up to them and asked to play a game of Marco Polo with them. And they said, hey, we can't hear. And there's no way that they could have their cochlear implant, or they could have their hearing aids in while they were at the pool, right? And so they were like, no, it's fine. We're gonna modify this. And so the kids, as they were just existing with these other deaf children, basically said, we're going to play Marco Polo, but we're going to play it in a way where you can participate too. And I think that in its own right, that's basically anything anybody wants, to know that they are able to participate in the communities and the society that they're born into and that they are a part of. So quotes to end on: a lot of different flowers make a bouquet. I thought this was really beautiful because a lot of different people exist, and our differences are what make us innately beautiful in that sense. And also to learn from each other that, we can all shine as brightly as one another. We can all be different types of flowers and still make a society good. So I thought that was really nice. Also, if a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way we learn, the way they learn. And I think that's also a really important sentiment too, that when you have a child that doesn't know how to learn in a particular sense that is traditional to the classroom or traditional to how we're used to teaching other children or other youth, understand that putting your practice of teaching them in a way that is accessible is just as important, because they are also your captive audience. They are also your students. They are also your constituents. They are also people and children in your lives that deserve access to information and love and care, and know that they are able to learn something in a way that is not a hindrance to them and is not a burden on anyone who's teaching them. So the delivery of that is also important as well. So that's it. Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time. Actually, next time will be next Thursday. That'll be in August, and we'll keep communicating and updated for that. But thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for having questions. Thank you for being here. I always appreciate when someone comes in and has a lot of interest in what we're talking about. So hope you all have a great rest of summer, and see you all soon.